Before we begin, may I kindly remind everyone that we have simultaneous interpretation that you can activate at the center bottom of your Zoom screen. ألفت انتباهكم أنه باستطاعتكم تشغيل خاصية الترجمة الفورية من الإنجليزية إلى العربية من خلال الضغط على الزر المشغل في أسفل الشاشة. We will also be live streaming this event on our Facebook page. Again, welcome to this webinar organized by the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, LCPS, and entitled, What Are Policymakers Paying Attention to? Introducing LCPS's Legislation Tracker. My name is Makram Ouais, and I'm the Executive Director at LCPS. It's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon and with our distinguished panel to launch LCPS's new Legislation Tracker, a project that has been 3 years in the making and that we hope will serve scholars, policymakers, media representatives, international partners, students, and other stakeholders to better understand the Lebanese government's priorities and compare and track legislation activity across different governments. This project has come to fruition thanks to the leadership and dedication of senior researcher Dr. Munir Mahmoud and the vision of my predecessor, Dr. Sami Atallah, who believed in the importance of such a tool for research and public policy in Lebanon, a vision that we share. The legislation tracker was a true team effort and engaged researchers Wasim Maktabi, Sami Zuhaib, and Ali Taha and Pierre Boutros. To all these members of the team, thank you for all your efforts. Such a complex tool would not have been possible without the technical support of a very talented team of programmers as well from RAM Services, led by founding partner Makram Raidan. Key to making this important project a reality was the generous support of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the trust it places in LCPS. The Embassy's sustained support for open government and promoting access to public information to all citizens over the years is greatly appreciated. Allow me to say a word about the tracker before we begin. As you are all well aware, policymakers, researchers, civil society activists, and media representatives rely on an accurate understanding of policymaking processes to be able to formulate policy recommendations. In Lebanon, access to such information remains unfortunately limited. Detailed record on vote cast in Parliament and the Cabinet, agenda items, meeting minutes, parliamentary questions, or legislative and executive decisions remain sparse or unavailable altogether. Despite greater access to information provided by the Access to Information Law passed in 2017, the limited availability of data makes systematic analysis of what, how, and why policymakers pay attention to what they pay attention to difficult to perform. To address this gap, LCPS has developed the Legislation Tracker, an analytical tool based on archival data that helps assess what Lebanon's policymakers pay attention to. The tool contributes to understanding the government's legislative and administrative activity based on Lebanon's official gazette, the official government journal that publishes all government decisions and legislative texts in order to be put into effect and become legally binding. LCPS downloaded, categorized, and analyzed every legislative text and decision for a number of recent governments and coded the legislation according to 3 methodologies. Nationally, as well as two newly developed
I cannot hear you, Makram.
by LCPS.
Okay.
So LCPS downloaded, categorized, and analyzed every legislative text and decision for a number of recent governments and coded the legislation according to three methodologies: the Comparative Agendas Project, known as CAP, which is used internationally, as well as two newly developed methodologies by LCPS. Okay. At the time when Lebanon is experiencing political gridlock and one of its most severe economic crises in recent history, LCPS has focused on ways to engage decision makers, public officials, scholars, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders to study and propose practical and innovative solutions and policies that can help Lebanon reestablish well-functioning government institutions, a vibrant private sector and civil society, and a country where we are not left with the choice to either sink or leave the country altogether. Our first panelist this afternoon is Dr. Basil Saluk, a senior fellow at the center and dear friend and former colleague at the Lebanese American University. Basil Saluk is currently associate professor of political science and head of the political and international relations program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. His main fields of specialization include comparative politics, political theory, and Middle East international relations. Basil's current research focuses on a critique of power sharing and arrangement in post-colonial and post-war states and the political economy of Lebanon's post-war collapse. A prolific writer, Saluk has co-authored and co-edited 4 books and authored numerous journal articles on topics such as the politics of sectarianism in post-war Lebanon, or the state of authoritarianism and democratization in the Arab world, among others. Basil is a senior fellow at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, as mentioned. He obtained both his MA and PhD in political science from McGill University in Canada. Professor Saluk will address the politics of transparency and information provision, as well as situate the legislation tracker in the broader context of Lebanon's political economy. Again, thank you, Basil, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Makram, and thank you, Munir, and all the friends at LCPS and in the audience. I want to sort of try to put the legislation tracker in a broader context, whether it is the consociational experience in Lebanon or the post-war political economy. Now, as the press briefer mentions in introducing the legislation tracker, it suggests that the rationale behind it is that despite progress on critical legislation to ensure transparency, Lebanon's policymaking process remains opaque. And I quote from your brief. I want to make the argument that the opaqueness of Lebanon's public policymaking is not inadvertent. It's actually rooted in Lebanon's own brand of consociational power sharing, which precludes accountability. And my argument is that this lack of accountability has something to do with the kind of consociational power sharing that was deployed in Lebanon, first in the post-independence period and then in the post-war period. And my argument is that unlike the classical European cases from which the theory of consociationalism was developed by Aaron Liphart, unlike the historical process that led to a political system that Liphart later called consociational power sharing, whereby we see the rise of cross-cuttingness in the four classical cases: Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, Austria. The rise of a politics of accommodation, the emergence of a protracted process of state formation that led to the emergence of strong state institutions, and the idea of equal democratic citizenship. In Lebanon, the process is reversed in the sense that the elite choice for consociation begins immediately after the state was created. The adoption of consociational power sharing by the elite, by the sectarian elite, entailed imagining a society that was divided only along sectarian or religious lines. And they did so to claim that they are the representatives of closed monolithic communities. And all this, in other words, consociationalism was deployed only to justify elite capture of the post-colonial state, or if you like, post-independence Lebanon. So I think the difference between the way consociationalism developed in the four classical cases after a protracted political process, historical process, after the emergence of political coalitions that were not only built on one religious identity, one linguistic identity, or one regional identity. I think the difference between that process and the four classical cases and how political elites claiming to be speaking on behalf of closed sectarian communities meant that in the case of Lebanon, both in the post-independence period, but also in the post-war period, the way consociationalism was instrumentalized meant that there would be no accountability. In fact, the theorist of consociationalism in Lebanon, Michel Chiha, perceived politics in Lebanon as a game among elites, whose main task was to undertake the kind of legislation that benefits the commercial and financial bourgeoisie. I think what, in hindsight, as we look back today from this moment of collapse, and we look back at the past 100 years of Lebanon's creation, I think what this has meant is that public policy has always been a function, in Lebanon, a function of elite clientelistic preferences. The exception, of course, to this stubborn rule was the experience of the presidency of Fuad Shahab, where public policy was placed at the service of building a strong state institutions, building social integration, building, if you like, a nation out of the Lebanese peoples. I think we see this trend magnified even more in the post-war period, in the sense that the way in which consociationalism, as it was deployed in Lebanon, was placed to preclude accountability, to preclude any sense of transparency in public policy making. We see it much more magnified in the post-war period. Of course, the consociational power sharing package was reformed in the Taif Accord to better reflect, albeit not accurately, the political, military, social balance of power. But I think what happens in the post-war period is that in the name of consociationalism, an alliance of political, economic, and later financial elites captured the state, captured the institutions of the state, captured public policy making to achieve two things, really. One was massive capital accumulation, always in the name of post-war reconstruction and the need to buy the post-war peace. The institutions of the state, the political economy of the state, public policy making under the guise of post-war reconstruction and the need to buy the post-war peace was placed at the service of capital accumulation and the transfer of wealth from the many, from society to the few, but much more importantly, to assemble a post-war political order in the sense that restructuring social forms, restructuring classes, bringing into the state sectarian constituencies and sectarian partisans. So when we look back now at the experience of the post-war period, whether first under the long Pax Syriana from 1990 till 2005, but when we also look at the post-2005 period, and when we think of the Troika, the experience of the Troika, when we think of Muhasasa, when we think of national unity governments, I think all these should teach us something important about the connection between consociationalism and how it was practiced in Lebanon, and the lack of any sense of accountability and transparency in public policymaking. And when I say that under the guise of post-war reconstruction and under the guise of literally buying the post-war peace, that is convincing former militia leaders to enter the political arena and drop their weapons, and creating the material basis for sectarian ideological consent in the post-war period. When I say that this was all done by capturing the political economy of the state and state institutions, I think we see this very clearly in the numbers. Now, if you want to understand how consociationalism served to preclude accountability, all what we need to do is look at the structure of government spending between 1993 and 2017. What we notice, and we have numbers for that due to the Herculean efforts of the people in the Ministry of Finance, what we notice is that out of the $195 billion spent in that period, government spending, 37% of that number was spent on interest on debt and debt repayments. 32.4% was spent on salaries, wages, pensions, compensations, and a meager 7.8% was spent on capital expenses. And I think this says a lot about how the post-war state was captured by an alliance of political, economic, and later joining them financial elites in the name of consociation, and how all this was done outside any sense of accountability or any need to feel that public policy should be transparent and somebody should be accountable for these decisions. Now, of course, today, and alas, this post-war political order has collapsed. And its collapse has opened up what I call the moment of extraordinary politics. Always at times of massive crisis, societies go through a period of extraordinary politics. We saw this in 2005 in Lebanon after the Hariri assassination. And in these periods, usually, we have an enormous amount of information about the past years. And today in Lebanon, of course, we all have experienced it. Fiscal monetary choices are put under scrutiny. And there is a lot of information coming out about the kind of fiscal and monetary decisions that were taken in the last 30 years that have brought us to the present collapse. Think about the PEG, the decision about the PEG. Think about the decision to start borrowing in dollars. Think about monetary choices. Think about the lost opportunities in the last 30 years to prevent us from reaching this collapse. And with this information at this moment of extraordinary politics comes a determined attempt by the political economic elite to escape accountability. I think a lot of what's happening in Lebanon today and what is presented as political battles and political machinations is really nothing but the attempt of those who took the kind of fiscal and monetary decisions that led to the collapse to avoid any kind of scrutiny and to avoid any kind of accountability. which is why I think today LCPS and the legislation tracker is so important. Because if we want to have any hope for some kind of a future in Lebanon, we have to bring back the ethics of accountability to public policy and to our public life. And I think the LCPS, the legislation tracker, is one way to do so. It is one way to do so through data-driven monitoring of government decisions. And so I look at the legislation tracker as one way, to borrow from Chomsky, if you like, of speaking truth to power and to put to task public policy and to put it under scrutiny. After all, data-driven accountability is really the only way for us to demystify all the narratives that are being created today to cover up for the past 30 years. In many ways, if you like, data-driven monitoring is the sectarian system's antidote. And I think this is what we dearly need at this moment of great crisis in Lebanon. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Basil, very much. I guess I think your concluding sentence says it all there about how data-driven accountability and monitoring might be, if I may use your words, a way of sort of addressing and dismantling this web of interest that unfortunately has led us to where we are today, and so thank you very much for this interesting take and for framing this discussion today in such a clear and interesting way. Our second speaker today is Professor Matt Loftis. And before I introduce him, I just want to remind all our participants today that we have simultaneous interpretation. At the bottom of your screen, you can access it. And I wanted to also mention that you are welcome to send any question you have in the chat box at this stage, which we will address once the presentations have happened. Dr. Matt Loftis is Associate Professor of Political Science at Aarhus University. His research interests include agenda setting, political control of bureaucracy, and local government. His work focuses on methods and applications of quantitative data analysis, machine learning, and collecting and managing large data sets. He is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Explaining Local Policy Agendas, Institutions, Problems, Elections, and Actors, including the first large-scale studies of local government policy agendas. Professor Loftis will provide an overview of CAP and reflect on the value the Lebanon project can add to the study of political agendas. Thank you again, Matt, for being with us today and for sharing your knowledge with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Makram, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I've brought slides, so I'll just share my screen if that's okay. Yes. Great, thank you. Well, I'm really glad to be here for two reasons, really. For one, I am looking forward to using this tool myself in my own research, but also I expect and I hope that the legislation tracker will leave its mark on my scientific field going forward. I want to take the time I have to provide some context around why I think this is a smart and useful and well-crafted contribution, both to the scientific research, but also to strengthening civil society. There we go. My perspective on this is influenced by the fact that I'd say I wished for a tool like this for the past 20 years or so. I began my career as a journalist, and I worked for a couple of years as an anti-corruption activist in Bucharest, Romania. And now, of course, I'm a political scientist and I do academic research on what we call agenda setting, right? And that is essentially exactly the title of today's events. What are politicians paying attention to? So I see the value of the legislation tracker is sort of twofold. I think on the one hand, it's an excellent tool. It's going to provide richly detailed information on government activity. The labels on policy really bring a lot of clarity and transparency to what actually is happening in the policymaking process. And linking policies together makes it possible to track how actually policy has evolved over time. That makes the core themes in policy legible to folks who are not necessarily intimately following the political process or, say, educated in law. But further, I think this is a model. In my work, I end up interacting quite a bit with official gazettes, as Makram called them, legislation portals where governments actually publish their own laws and decrees and so on. And it's remarkable, but official legislation trackers across Western Europe, and I'm very familiar with at least 15 of them, they don't meet the standards that we see in this legislation tracker. There's no substantive labels for policies. One can find, oh, this came from a particular ministry or an agency, but it's not clear what that's necessarily about. Furthermore, linking together laws with their implementing measures and so on is something that, in my experience, I have not found a government that does that substantively in their own data. So it's really, really valuable to have that. And furthermore, that kind of information is just necessary for the next steps in the research that I and others are doing. So in my opinion, the legislation tracker is just the template now for how to do this tracking correctly. So I want to begin with the scientific perspective on why this is so important. I mentioned that I study agenda setting, and the core sort of thinking on that is that attention itself is actually the scarcest resource in politics. And that's because there is no limit on the number of problems, interest groups, individual concerns that government might need to attend to and that compete for government attention. Politicians and bureaucrats that actually handle government policymaking, they have limited time though, and they're human. And so they also have a limited capacity to focus on more than one thing at a time. So we have this concept of the policy agenda, and that refers to all the topics that government pays attention to. And what's useful about that concept is that when you think of it this way, then you realize every policy change, every time the government passes an entirely new law on a new issue or amends an old law, it begins with the decision to say, okay, now we're going to talk about this issue. And we're not going to talk about something else, it's this. That really situates agenda setting at the core of politics. And so having data on that is tremendously valuable if you want to understand what government is doing. So this research program has a number of basic questions that it asks that are really at the heart of politics. Why does government work on one policy and not another? More importantly, perhaps, why do governments, and this happens around the world, why do they ignore some very severe problems, but then attend to several less severe problems more frequently? And what determines when an issue will break onto the policy agenda? Does it have to have a certain critical threshold of media attention? Does the problem have to get severe enough? These are things that we continue to struggle to really understand. In democracies, of course, this kind of question is really at the heart of the political system, because if elected politicians don't focus on citizens' needs and priorities, what are we doing, right? What is democracy actually providing then? Even in non-democracies, however, it still tells us about the capacity of the government to actually govern and its effectiveness. So these are really broad questions that we can ask about any political system. The scientific study of agenda setting, in fairness, you could say it goes back to like the early 1990s. The concepts are older, but we began in that period with some time series studies of the United States, and that data was beginning to be collected that's sort of recognizable from what we study today. Cross-national studies have become really common thanks to the Comparative Agendas Project. So this is a group that began as an informal set of scientific collaborations around 20 plus years ago. It's become much more formalized now. There's an annual conference and there's a web presence where data resources are shared since 2016. The CAP, the Comparative Agendas Project, the CAP group maintains standards for coding policy agendas, and it's tremendously valuable that this has been applied in this legislation tracker. I'll just briefly cover what that does. The CAP coding system, the big innovation here is that it begins with thinking very broadly about what do all governments focus on? And when you do that, of course, there's some discussion around how you could define these, but there are really only a couple dozen very major topics if you aggregate them. Things like the economy, civil rights, health, etc. Some of these are more basic than others, but all of them include minor topics as well. So the economy would be anything that might have to do with interest rates, unemployment rates, monetary policy, these kinds of things. So it's a hierarchical system for putting anything that government works on into a particular box. The way that these codes are applied is that we take an item on any policy agenda. So that could be one law passed by Parliament or an item in the national budget, and we associate it with one topic. If two topics apply or more, then the more basic topic prevails. So the coding system includes a hierarchy of which topics are more basic. For example, a law that addresses both health and agriculture would be coded health. A law addressing both civil rights and law enforcement is civil rights. The system is relatively simple, but it's been now decades of refinement that have been brought to it with the research, and the results in the sort of empirical studies show that it has quite strong measurement validity. That is, when we think we're measuring health, a reasonable reader can see that, yeah, this is related to health, right? So it's become a tool that we've used in political science now for some time, and it's thoroughly integrated into some very general theories of politics. It's helped create some new discoveries of how the political system works and deals with new issues. And it's helped facilitate an enormous data collection project that the CAP now manages. So these are exciting times, right, for me and my field. However, I want to highlight here a couple of the big challenges that we face because they're very relevant to this project. On the one hand, CAP has grown quite a bit, but we're still looking at a project that only has data on around 20 countries, and that's generous. Really, the more complete data is for a smaller set. And the CAP world, so to speak, is very weighted toward Anglophone and Western European countries. Lastly, CAP has a historical tendency now to only focus on the top level of the policy agenda. And by that, I mean laws passed by Parliament or Congress, the national budget, presidential speeches, and so on. So some of my research, we've done this at the local level of government. So this is improving a bit, but I am so happy about the legislation tracker project because it helps resolve all three of these. So it really makes a strong contribution here. The first, I think, is quite obvious, but I want to just drill down a bit on this other two. So this map shows you where there are sort of official CAP data collection projects underway right now. And we've yet to reap the benefits of the Brazil, Turkey, and Russia projects. Those are underway. There's also one in South Korea. But for the rest, you can clearly see where this map is weighted toward. And this is bad for scientific work, right? We're only comparing relatively similar countries in the work that's being done right now. It's too little variation on government institutions, political party systems, and traditions, history, and culture. So the advent of Lebanon to this project is of tremendous value. Third, and this is, I can't stress this enough because I do some of my own work on this topic as well. The bulk of legislation that we see across the world in all modern states, the bulk of legislation is not the laws that get passed in Parliament. It is the secondary legislation, secondary in the sense that it implements these laws. These are things like decrees, orders, rules. My own research has shown, so I have a paper from 2015 in which I show that implementation process is where a lot of corruption actually hides, right? this has not been a subject of study in CAP research. In fact, no formal studies at all have examined the policy agenda at the level of decrees and orders. So legislation tracker is absolutely path-breaking in right from the start, including secondary legislation. And this is just a great contribution. This is really, it puts it at the level of a standard that now many in the CAP community are working toward. And I think this tool will be the model for all of us as we're building the next generation of tools. I'll just briefly circle back now to talk a little bit beyond scientific impact. I think that this project is also in the best tradition of transparency and advocacy tools. The work of organizing and translating government activity is just crucial to ameliorating the disparity in access to information that virtually all political systems suffer from. Some actors are just always well informed about the history of a policy area, who the important actors are, what the rules are, where we've been. And tools like this allow citizens, interest groups, media to very quickly come up to speed on a policy area and understand what's going on. And it reveals things that sometimes aren't even obvious from the beginning. I'll just tell one brief story to illustrate. When I worked for Transparency International in Bucharest, it was around the time Romania was joining the European Union. And there was a great deal of conflict with the European Commission over how much Romania was working on the fight against corruption. We spoke with many media organizations in that time who were interested in hearing about Transparency International's opinion on how well the government was performing in fighting corruption. Well, just before accession, the government passed a number of laws that, if you read them, they were quite good, quite strong anti-corruption laws. And so the conversation was always, journalists would ask, well, these are good laws, the commission seems happy, are you happy? And it was very difficult to communicate to them. On the one hand, yes, we think these laws are good, but if you look at what's happening in the ministry, if you look at the lack of decrees implementing these laws, this is very out of step with the way policy is normally made. These are very alarming signs. And that message was incredibly hard to communicate, because the information we needed to kind of show, well, here's the pattern and here's why this is wrong, it was in 20 different websites. It was not organized so that you could illustrate it clearly. And a tool like this was just what we needed to say, hey, here's what this should look like. Here's what's happening now and why it's a problem. And I really look forward to seeing the legislation tracker employed in ways like that as well, because it's really, really nicely targeted for this. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much for this very interesting overview of the importance of CAP projects in political science and in developing theories and other applications. I would like to also thank you for shedding a light on the specificities that relate to the legislation tracker that LCPS has developed, and then no better person to talk about this than our colleague, Dr. Munir Mahmoud, who is a former senior researcher at LCPS. His research focuses on the political economy of reform, conflict, and development. Other experiences of his include positions at the World Bank, as well as the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, UNESCO. He was a researcher fellow at American University of Beirut and Harvard University, and holds a PhD in political economy from Dublin City University. Munir, thank you for all your efforts in getting us here, and the floor is yours.
Makram, Basil, Matt, so many thanks for your interventions and for introducing this important topic. I'm going to talk to you about the legislation tracker itself. Before I do that, I'll use a couple of words on some theory to invite you to lay out some ways by which I invite you to think about this data that I'm going to present to you now. Before I do that, once again, I really want to stress that this was joint work. I really want to thank Makram for your leadership. I really want to thank also Dr. Samia Tella, who was launching this project with me. Also Pierre, Wasim, Ali, Sami, who made an important contribution here. Thank you so much. Also Makram Raidan, Mazen Slim from RAM Services, they did an amazing job. And I think this is something that I hope can set standards going forward. So long talks today. I want you to take 3 points out of this seminar and out of my presentation, which is, first of all, this hopefully is you will assess this as hopefully an interactive and novel tool, a useful tool to assess policymakers' political agenda, which is freely accessible to the public. And we will make this tool online in a couple of days on the LCPS webpage, the new one, by the way. Secondly, I want to convince you that legislation data, the way that Matt already so nicely illustrated to us, can reveal a lot about Lebanon's policy making. I remember very well when I started to think about and prepare this project for almost 5 years ago now. It really took a long time to come to fruition like this. I was trying to convince actually a lot of people that this is a useful thing to think about policy making by looking at legislation. And I got a lot of responses at that time saying, don't look at that in Lebanon because nothing is going on anyway. Today, I want to show you, yes, there's a lot going on. We can learn a lot about how policymaking works. 3, this offers new opportunities for research journalism and political accountability. And I want to stress here, this is the beginning of a journey, and your thoughts are appreciated, and your feedback is very welcome on how to improve and how to use this tool. So we have heard now a lot about what the problem actually is. So it's this opaque process that has little available data, making quantitative comprehensive analysis very scarce and very few. Basil Saluk is one of the authors of some of the papers that attempt to do so and very insightfully do so, yet this kind of analysis until today, unfortunately, remains sparse. Now, I was thinking, okay, so what data do we actually have available? And if you think about it, you come relatively swiftly actually to the main tool and source of data on legislation and policy making, which is the Lebanese political official gazette, which is the official governmental journal all legislation has to be published in order to be taken into effect. The official gazette is a physically printed book, basically, that is being published by the so-called official gazette department, which is associated with the office of the prime minister. It publishes all legislative texts that are being published in the week until Thursday. Every week it comes out on a Thursday. There are several private companies then who have the concession to take this physically printed copy of the legislation, scan it, and then publish it on their web pages. And this source of information really has a couple of advantages vis-a-vis other sources of information, which is it's comprehensive. Everything that wants to be put into effect and that should be placed into effect, it should be published there. It's up to date. When it's not published there, it's not into effect. So there is no time lag to be expected. At least there should not be according to the law. And it's publicly available. I mean, unfortunately, many of these sources actually have to be paid, but in principle, all legislation that is being published is freely publicly accessible. And what I want to convince you of is that there's a little bit of theory. We can learn a lot about policymaking beyond the mere content of legislations. So in order to do that, let me cover a little bit of ground in terms of what we actually see when we look at these different legislative texts that are being published. Let's go for 1 second and look at the Lebanese legal code. We have many different forms of legislative text, but we have basically 4 different types: laws, decrees, resolutions, and circulars. All of these legislative texts have different issuing bodies, have a different function, and have something that, and I want to draw your attention to the last column here, what can be referred to as institutional friction. And this is basically a concept that tells us that each of these different types of legislation require a different amount of resources, different kinds of resources, in order to be placed into effect. Voting time, so different voting requirements, different time policymakers have to pay attention to it. different monetary resources that are being deployed to study a specific proposal by deploying law firms, economic consultants, what have you. And let's drill down to this in a little bit more detail because it helps us understanding what we actually see here. Matt was already talking about what we call agenda capacity. Now, agenda capacity is broadly speaking a function of two things, of two issues. The first is what Matt has already talked about, which are cognitive constraints of policymakers. Every policymaker, any polity can only pay attention to so many things at the same time. You cannot have 20 minutes at one day, you can only have 5, and you actually have to choose which of these 5 meetings you want to attend. The second point here is the institutional friction. Each of the projects carries, the legislative projects that you want to implement actually carries with it. And this is a function of different costs, what you can refer to as costs, decision-making costs, transaction costs, information costs. Basically to say that if you have a law that is contentious, you need to spend a lot of time talking to different members of parliament and to convince them as to why it is important to actually vote on this specific bill. You have to deploy lawyers, you have to deploy consultancies in order to get the information necessary in order to write and craft a specific legislation, and so on and so forth. It's actually costly to do politics and to do policy making. It's not something that comes without effort. And the higher we go in the legal hierarchy, on average, the higher the friction is. So at lower stages of the hierarchy, such as ministerial resolutions, these legislative texts are subject to less institutional friction than legislative texts that are at higher stages of the hierarchy, such as laws. Now, let's look into this in a little bit more detail. So when we look at the lower end of the hierarchy spectrum, so circulars, then we see that these are mostly notices for public administrations itself. So it's basically regulating the relationship of public administrations with each other. So for example, one circular could be a notice to administrations to reduce staff during the lockdown. So this is clearly an administrative measure. However, if we look at the other side of the hierarchy, and if you look at laws, then we see that this can be a little bit blurred as well. So obviously laws are then something significant, such as introducing the national budget or regulating public procurement. So clearly regulating stuff, social life. But also there can actually be something very mundane, something very simple, such as changing the name of a village, something that doesn't actually regulate something. This is something that actually administers. And the same holds true for decrees and resolutions. So here we have really the question of, do we actually, there's the specific legislation that we talk about. Is this actually administering something? Is it regulating something? How can we relate to that? And if we make this kind of distinction, we can attempt a little taxonomy. If we plot the hierarchy of a legislative text to the nature of a text, so whether it's administrative or regulatory, we get a little 4x4 or here 3x2 matrix that I find useful, and I hope to convince you that you also find useful to think about when we interpret the data that is going to be displayed from the legislation tracker. So we basically have then 6 different ways, 6 different types of legislation that hold very different institutional frictions and carry different institutional frictions with them. The lower end, we would have administrative resolutions passed by a minister, which basically could be the registration of an NGO or could be a trade license that you give to a business. At the higher end would be regulatory laws, which could be an electricity sector reform, budget laws, tax reform, these kind of things. And there is a lot of nuance in between. So I want to invite you to keep that in mind when we are looking at the data. And I want to prepare you that our codebook is structured accordingly, that we can apply this lens to the data and the analysis that we're going to see. Now, what kind of data do we have now? So the initial data that is going to be made available on the LCPS webpage is the data that is from January 2019 to November 2022, covering the governments of Saad Hariri, Hassan Diab, and Najib Miati. Now we're working on the government of Tamam Salam, which is going to be made available in a couple of weeks' time, hopefully. this data is being based on the dataverse of the law university, the law faculty of the Lebanese University, of which we parsed 17 variables, including the data, the edition of the official gazette, the dates by which it has been published and signed, who signed it, what kind of text is it, what is its subject title, and so on and so forth. So just to give you a sense of what that actually entails. So from 2019, Jan 2019 to August 2020 alone, we're talking about 3,800 legislative texts, each of which we coded. And you see here really the distribution, and which is catering to the argument that Matt just made. If we look at what policymaking looks like, media attention is mostly actually drawn to the 3% of laws that we are talking about. The bulk of policymaking, the bulk of what government does every day, is actually the decrees and resolutions that no one really pays much attention to. So accordingly, we have structured our codebook into 4 different dimensions. So each legislative text, each observation in our data set carries not only the 17 variables that I was just talking about, but it is also carrying, and this is applied by us, these 4 different dimensions: the policy area, Matt was talking about it, then the nature, the administrative function, and the government. 2 and 3 has been developed by us, while the 4th one is according to fixed dates. And let me go through these very quickly one by one. Policy area, according to the comparative agendas methodology, I just want to give you this brief introduction here to give you a sense of what that actually means in terms of policy areas and subtopics. I show the example of the policy area education, where you then have a couple of subtopics, such as higher education or legislative text pertaining to elementary schools and secondary and vocational training, etc. Now, the CAP folks among us will, I have to confess that we committed some heresy here, because we did something that is might not be allowed otherwise, which is we added some additional categories to accommodate the fact that we have additional legislative texts that are not normally coded under the CAP coding scheme, which are naturalizations and citizenships and registrations. We have coded them accordingly so that they can easily be filtered out if need be. So more information about the whole project can be found under comparativeagendas.net, as well as the master codebook. Just to show you that there is indeed some very interesting variation by government, this is a very simple graph showing the top policy areas by comparing the Saad Hariri government, the Hassan Diab government, basically showing things like that Diab was understandably much more focused on issues pertaining to macroeconomics than Saad Hariri was, etc. Second, we're talking about the nature. We basically differentiate between 2 functions of government. First, the administrative nature of legislative texts, but basically applying an already existing rule to specific individuals or organizations. Examples of this would be licensing a business, appointing personnel, what have you. Now, regulatory ones are those that establish or change an impersonal or generally applicable rule. This would be something that changes, for example, the tax administration, that is passing the budget, that is introducing new educational curricula, these kind of things. Now, we are also introducing a third nature in our coding scheme, which is what we refer to as international agreements, which is basically everything that manages the relationship of Lebanese governmental institutions with foreign governments and foreign entities. To show you that there is indeed some very interesting variation of the nature of a legislative text, the type of legislation. What is interesting here is to know that, yes, circulars, for example, are almost exclusively administrative in nature. Resolutions, however, already are to more than 30% already regulatory. So they can be quite important for the lives of a lot of people, while laws are actually only to about 60% regulatory in nature. A lot of laws that we see is actually administrative, more than 10% in the Lebanese case, or international agreement. comparing by governments is also something that might be interesting, showing that the government of Hassan Diab, for example, was much more regulating than Saad Hariri would have been. These are very simple exercises just to showcase that there is something to investigate here. And I'll come to that in a second more. Thirdly, the administrative function. So when we realized, when we investigated the more administrative legislations, we realized that many of these are actually fulfilling very specific tasks and that are very monotone over time. So we identified a set of keywords based on which we can very clearly distinguish more than 30 different administrative functions, such as the termination of employment, such as issuing stamps, such as registering an NGO. So we assigned each administrative function, administrative legislative text, also a specific function, which also has quite interesting variation among governments and over time. So the coding flow is as follows. We have refers. Is there a feedback? Is there a question of someone? So we have we first identify whether a legislation is regulatory or administrative in nature, or if it's an international agreement. Then if it's regulatory, we directly assign it a policy area and no administrative function. Otherwise, we apply to it administrative function, while we then apply as well a cap code, or in the case of naturalizations or registrations, we leave it at that point. To give you two quick examples of a legislative text of how that would look like, the formation of a committee to supervise the infrastructure work in a specific village. This would be administrative in nature, has the function of establishing a committee, and would then be coded as transportation infrastructure for the policy area. Another example would be to adjust the curriculum for here aircraft mechanics for the technical baccalaureate degree. This would be regulatory in nature because it's amending a generally applicable rule and not only for a specific institution. So it does not have an administrative function. It would then be a policy area, education, vocational. Now, there are a couple of interesting applications here, one of which Matt was already talking about. It can tell us a lot about how corruption and rent seeking actually happens. Now, I guess there's the time that I would have to mention some of my own work, which is, I hope, understandable because I was just working with this data. And I want to make you aware of, for example, one paper that I was publishing with Declan Curran 2 years ago, where I set up this framework that I was showing to you earlier in a bit more detail. And I portray a framework on political collaboration on reform with application to Lebanon. Another paper that I published with Sami Zreib last year actually takes this kind of data and shows that, and basically quantifies the impact of sectarianism on the efficiency of public administrations and the output that bureaucracies have. So let me showcase now to you the legislation tracker itself. And I change my screen here. So enough of the theory talk. Now let's get some hands-on here. What you see here is our backend on how we administer the legislation data that we parse from the law faculty of the Lebanese University. We have all the legislative texts here, basically in a long list of legislative texts that we can accordingly filter in very different ways and organize it in very different ways. Each of the legislative texts, then, you can see each of its properties, its signatories, its content that we can translate as well, and we can assign to it different dimensions. So this is the way that we are organizing our data. Now, we are then pushing it to what we call the dashboard. And this is what you're going to be able to see on in the LCPS webpage in a couple of days. So what we see here is what we, but it is basically the visualization tool of this tracker. Okay, so here we have basically different properties of how you can build a graph, either as a line graph, as a bar graph, or as a time series, and then you have different filter options. Now, crucially, we have two ways to access all these different options, something that I come to in a little bit. Now, we are going to focus for 1 second on the so-called basic builder. Now, whenever you want to load a graph, you click on load, and what we see here is basically x-axis has the time, as you see here. We have the breakdown, which has to no breakdown. So what does breakdown mean? It's basically showing us by which dimension you want to have the number of legislations that we see here on the y-axis to be disaggregated. Okay, I'll show in a second what that actually means. Here on the y-axis, we have the total number of legislation that here in this specific case would be in each week that we observe in our data set. We have different filters by the different coding schemes that I was just introducing to you: the policy area, the administrative function, and the nature, as well as by the time. You can filter for the signatory date, for the print date of the Gazette, or we can filter for a specific government. Now, let's apply this. Let's take a very simple exercise, and we want to actually understand what we see here, describe the data a little bit better. And let's take the let's take as an x-axis the different types of legislation, laws, decrees, resolutions, what have you, as the basis. And let's see by which nature all of these data that we have so far in our data set is being disaggregated by. The graph that we are going to see now is basically a different version of the graph that I have showed you earlier, which is basically to say that here decrees are that we have a lot of administrative decrees. We see here the legend on the right-hand side. Red is basically administrative legislations, orange is regulatory, blue are international agreements. Basically to say that a lot of these decrees here, or marasim, are administrative in nature, while there are actually quite a bit regulatory ones as well as international agreements. We have here arat, so decisions, which are both regulatory and administrative in nature, both to almost to equal terms, while laws are much fewer. This is just to give you an overview of what we have, while you can also see here that there are a lot of other legislation types that, however, are not that important, but will be coded at a later stage of this project. Let's go on, let's compare. And let's compare, for example, by government, something that we have that I have showed to you earlier already. So what we can do here, for example, is to take as an x-axis, take the government, and as a breakdown, the policy area. Let's focus for the moment on the two governments that we have complete data for, at least here in the tool, which is the governments of Saad Hariri and Hassan Diab, and build the associated graph. What we're going to see now is this aggregation of the absolute number of legislation of each of the governments, Diab and Hariri, to all the different policy areas, the major policy topics that we see in the CAP code. Now, what we can do, actually, we can focus a little bit more. We can say, look, let's focus on something that is quite salient, that was quite salient in the last couple of months due to the economic crisis, and let's focus on, say, macroeconomics and, let's say, government observations. So basically investigating the legislative response to the administrative and the economic shortcomings and crises. What we see here is then that the tracker is automatically drilling down to these policy areas. Now, we can say, look, what did they actually do? And the beauty of this tool now is that once you click on the specific data point that you want to have, it shows to you, to the user, all of the legislative texts that have been published in that specific category. And not only this, it also provides you with the hyperlink to the full content of the text that you can then easily access. So what we can see here is that this is now not filtered by any kind of other administrative function, but as Matt was already introducing to you, actually focusing on secondary legislation is actually something that can be super insightful. So let's do that. And one thing that we realized is actually very interesting to see is to look at something that is quite common here, which is licensing. And this is something that is basically, so licensing is the administrative act of granting a concession to any kind of individual or to any kind of organization, such as import licenses, such as licenses to operate a hospital, whatever it can be. There are a lot of concessions that government needs to make, which is something that is worth noticing and worth investigating, as there becomes apparent, if you look in more detail, some interesting disparities here, for example, that I want to make you aware of. There is an interesting spike, just as an example to illustrate, on November, in the edition of November 7, 2019. And I want to invite you for 1 second to think about what just happened the week before, in the week on 31st of October, 2019. Well, yes, it was actually the day on which the government of Saad Hariri resigned. So what we see here is an incredible spike in licensing just at the day or the day before or after, just around the resignation of the Saad Hariri government, which comes at a time when millions and millions of Lebanese were demanding their rights on the streets. While what the government was doing was actually busy signing licenses for new businesses, for import licenses, what have you. This is something, this is the way that we can deploy and use this tool for trying to assume accountability, to hold politicians to accountability. So I want to also make you aware of what we have as what we call the advanced builder, which offers you basically other ways to build these graphs that are a bit more complex. So we have the three types of graphs that I have just introduced to you: line graph, bar graphs, time series. While we here introduce also radar graphs, pie charts, and in fact also data tables. So if we do a radar graph now, for example, and we can then use governments as the x-axis, we will be able to see which government, for example, in our data set has issued most legislation, which is now clearly Saad Hariri 3 government, because we have not yet completed the coding for Tamam Salam and Ajib Meati. What we can do as well is, as a breakdown, we can again use a different perspective and basically try to understand in which area which government has been how active. What I want to also make you aware of is that if you want to look at this in more detail, you can see all of this also in table view, which you can export, so you can do statistical analysis quickly and easily. With this, I want to leave it. I am very happy to showcase more. If there is feedback, I'm very happy to hear your thoughts. I want to thank again and all the participants, Basil and Matt. Thanks very much for your contributions. Makram, for your introduction. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think we're opening the floor for feedback. Many thanks for all the attendees for listening. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Munir, and for this thorough presentation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are welcoming your questions through the chat box, but also if you'd like to raise your hand, we can also give you the floor to ask your question. We had a question from Nancy asking how are international agreements and treaties coded? Maybe to expand a little bit on that question. Munir, would you like to take that? And maybe we could also ask Matt to comment on that as to how it's done at the international level, or if there's any specific perspectives there he would like to add. So, Munir?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So international treaties are basically mostly referring, so first of all, the nature then is being coded as an international agreement. Then if a treaty then refers to, for example, a contribution or an acceptance of international contributions, such as aid or such as in-kind contributions, we would assign to it the specific administrative function, while on a policy level, we would then assign it on the policy area level, we would then assign to it the CAP code to which it would be to the policy area to which it would pertain. So, for example, if the in-kind contribution is related to military assistance, then we would code it under defense.
Sorry to follow up, but it could be also considered not administrative but regulatory, or not at all. They're mutually exclusive.
No, they would be mutually exclusive. There would be only.
Let's say if an international agreement imposes, let's say, anti-corruption standards, wouldn't you label that as regulatory?
This is a very, very good question. Thanks very much for that. Yes, but the agreement itself does not do that. But the legislation that follows from that should do that. And these, yes, we would code as regulatory. But the agreement itself, like the legislative text that says we adopt and we endorse this kind of agreement, no. This would be in our category coding scheme would be as the national agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for your question. And Matt, would you like to add anything at this stage?
Well, actually, I was going to add a little bit of context around the code book, but I see that Sean is here, and so perhaps yeah, I don't know if you had something to add to that or not. But I was just going to say that this is sort of well covered in the code book, and there are systems for that. But one of the advantages with the CAP system is that it's flexible, right? And so there isn't any reason why you wouldn't say, oh, these are perhaps trade agreements or international agreements of some sort, and then silo those off and then say, well, now within that set, let's think about what other code applies, right? And so that sort of flexibility is always on the table with these. And it sounds like Munir's done something precisely like that. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. Sean, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Great, thanks. Hey, so thanks so much for putting on this really interesting conversation. And Matt, I thought your explanation and summary of CAP was just fantastic. In fact, I'm going to ask later for the video of just that so that we can show it to all of our first years so they get right. They learn a whole lot about US policy agenda project, but it'd be nice if they had the broader perspective that you provided with CAP. But Munir, I have a question for you, and it's great to see you. Right, so you said we a lot, so we coded. So could you just, right, as someone who's responsible for a lot of the coding for the American project, so could you just unpack that a little bit and what you mean by, like, who's the team and how exactly you go about doing it, and a little bit about the logistics surrounding that? Just because I'm hoping to get some efficiencies maybe that you've worked out that maybe we could implement so that we can code more data more quickly.
Sean, thank you so much for that question, and it's so great to see you. So how did we do that? We have, in the first step, on the stage of parsing the data, we implemented directly and we load this data into the backend of the legislation tracker. And based on a set of keywords that we have identified for each of the dimensions that we're outlining, we are assigning an automatic code. So we pre-allocate each legislative text to one code according to the set of keywords that we were identifying. These pre-allocations, obviously, we have to review them. So we have a team of 2 data officers that were permanently deployed in each of the stages of the project that were reviewing these automatic code allocations, each of them one by one. They would then so-called submit each legislation in the back end for basically me to review. So they would then they would basically change the property of each of the legislations, so each of the observations, from pending, it has to be reviewed, to submitted, it has reviewed by the data officers, and then I would come and I would approve them. Basically say, yes, this is good, or no, we should probably go back and we should discuss a little bit of what we have. And then once I approve them, they would appear on the front end, what you see, what I just introduced to you as the legislation tracker. Does that answer the question?
It does answer the question. So everything is both machine coded and human eyes pass it at some point.
Yes, exactly. And this just saves a lot of time because, as I mentioned, there is a lot of standards actually, as we mentioned, as we realized, there is a lot of standardization, especially in the types of legislative text that we can very easily code based on keywords. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And right, before I give up the microphone, I'll just compliment you because of the seamlessness with which you're able to access all of these data points, right? Like we pride ourselves on the US team about having all of these data sources, but I don't think that we've figured out a way to seamlessly analyze them all at the same time in quite the way that you have. And so you very much have set a standard. So kudos to you for all of your hard work.
Thanks so much. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Sean. We have our next question from Basma Abdul Khalid. Basma says, thanks for the presentation. Would the tracker consider the legislation issued to respond to a certain reform agenda, like, for example, economic and governance reforms, in a way to track how reform commitments are practically translated? Munir, would you?
Unfortunately, Makram, would you mind to actually repeat the question, because I
Sure.
have to.
Sure. So the question is, would the tracker consider the legislation issued to respond to a certain reform agenda, like, for example, economic and governance reforms, in a way to track how reform commitments are practically translated?
So this, thank you. Very good question. So what this pertains to is the question as to how laws would be implemented. And as Matt mentioned, each law needs to be implemented by bureaucracies via implementation decrees or resolutions on ministerial level. Well, eventually we're going to be able to link the implementation decrees to the or what you can conceive as the mother or parent law, because each of the implementation decrees normally in the title would refer to a specific law and legislative text. So we are not doing this at this point. This is envisaged as something, because it's quite complex to program that. We envisage that at a later point where we can then basically trace which the linkages between legislative texts. So at this point, we cannot say with specificity in the backend itself and in the legislative tracker itself that you see as a front end, which law has been implemented how. This would be something that we would then have to do manually at this stage. In a future iteration of the tracker, we hope that we can make like a standardized way to follow the implementation process of each of the laws.
Thank you for this very interesting question. I'm going to go next to Elisar, then Nancy, and then Khalid. Elisar, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. I think that this tool is great and much needed. I have a question, Munir. At some point when you were in one of the slides, we were showcasing the matrix, you were saying something along the lines that circulars are not very consequential, I think. that circulars have low friction. And I was just thinking about BDL circulars recently and how those do actually have been having a lot of impact on capital controls. So I don't know if you could go back to the slide or maybe explain to me where BDL circulars fit into the tracker. Thank you.
Many thanks. Excellent question. Very important. So I want to make 2 points to that. First of all, in particular, central bank circulars are coded as a separate administrative function. So they are not captured in the same way. And at the moment, they're not actually appearing in the data set. So this is a different, entirely different cup of tea because it's a different political entity. Even though they appear in the official gazette, yes, but we have not captured them here. So that's one. Second, you're making a broader point here. You're bringing me to a broader point, which is what we are not trying to make an argument about is the extent to which each of the legislative texts would be politically contentious or actually requires political bargaining, or in the sense that, for example, a simple quote unquote appointment of an employee obviously can be something extremely consequential and extremely contentious. What we are trying to say here is, with this way of looking at legislation, is that that on average the requirements to have a specific text enacted differ among types of legislation, and precisely because that's not uniform among the different natures of legislative texts of different types, we want to introduce this kind of nuance in the taxonomy that we're introducing. So thank you very much. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elisar. We'll go next to Nancy. Nancy, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you again. My question is, it's not entirely clear to me where Parliament fits in all of this framework. Is it here we're assuming that government and Parliament are one entity and we combine all legislations discussed in both institutions? And if so, are legislations passed by Parliament assumed efficient on the side of government? Because you're trying to, in a way, compare different government activities across different phases, right?
So the legislation that would come out from Parliament would be laws, and obviously we are capturing laws here, which you can filter out specifically in the notably in the advanced builder, which we have a filter for the specific type of legislative text. So if you would like to see only laws, then you could do that as well. Otherwise, we're not trying to make any kind of more nuanced argument about what the specific observations entail in terms of efficiency, etc. Yet you are able to differentiate between the different types of legislative activity. Yes, Nancy, does that answer the question? I hope I captured it.
Yeah, it does. So I just wanted to make sure that there is disaggregate data per Parliament and government.
Yes.
Great, thank
Certainly.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nancy. The next question is then from Khalid Al-Sabah. Khalid asks, did you consider judicial jurisprudence in the coding process, as it can have a direct impact on the application of certain laws, decrees, etc.? And adds, example, impact of some recent jurisprudence on the application of code of currency and credit. That's the question. Munir?
So we cannot, so with this way of looking at legislation data, we cannot make an argument about what I think you refer to as jurisprudence. We cannot talk about the extent to which a legislative text would be contested, justified, how it fits into a broader context. What we are basically saying is this is something that is out there and enters legal force and is either being challenged or not challenged, depending on how people look at that. while we are not trying to make the argument about the extent to which any of these legislations would be contentious or not, or would be referring to other legislation or can be contested. This would be something that would be, this is also why we're making available the links to the original text of a legislation. This would be something that the reader then would have to make himself aware of and make his own judgment or her judgment.
Thank you, Munir. We have time for a couple more questions. So Muhammad, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Makram. Hi, Munir. Hope all is good. Just to add some context to the whole platform, because I think granularity is extremely important in this type of analysis. I will just give you some tips on certain things, and maybe these can be taken into consideration going forward. One, on the question of jurisprudence, it is important to always track the Constitutional Court decisions, because the Constitutional Court, once asked to review a specific legislation, may annul partially or entirely, and that has implications on legislation as a whole. The second is that we have seen during the course of this specific presidency a very high number of laws that were voted at Parliament and rejected by the President of the Republic, who I didn't see that he is monitored in any manner. The third, and that comes back to Elisar's question and probably some of other questions, is the real segregation in Lebanon between government and parliament, who are not necessarily working hand in hand. And you have two types of legislation at the law level, and then we come to decrees, decisions, etc. On law level, i.e. laws coming out, you have something called a draft laws presented by government to parliament, and you have proposition of laws who are proposed by a certain number of MPs directly to parliament without passing through government. The differentiation is extremely important, and also to see where the parliament is coming in to change certain thoughts and where government is filling the final legislative gap. Finally, I would say now that you may be looking at providing even further understanding of how implementation is meant, on top of the implementing decrees, which are certainly extremely important, but they have proven through the last probably 20 years or so of active legislation, not enough. First, in everything that is related to regulatory matters, overseeing matters, what you would see is that you have all the implementing decrees, but you don't have an appointment of the regulatory authority, which is by itself has been judged by the Shura Council, which is our highest administrative court, as a blocking of the law itself. And that is extremely, extremely dangerous. This is where I think combining all of these and getting the data will allow a better understanding and better analysis of all of this data making sense, not only about what would government would do, parliament, president of republic, and constitutional court as the case may be.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Munir, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. These are very good comments that we would probably have to think about a little bit, and how to include them into future work. But yeah, thank you very much for pointing this out. This is very good feedback.
Thank you very much, Munir, and I don't see any other questions, and we're up against our time, and so if there isn't any final question, I would like to again thank everyone's participation in this important webinar, and to thank our distinguished panelists, Basil, Matt, and obviously Munir, for their contribution, and to thank the LCPS team who helped organize today's event, and our interpreters, who as always do a great job. Again, thank you for being with us, and I hope you found this discussion interesting, and we hope that you will make good use of the legislation tracker as soon as it's up and running on our website. Again, thank you, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.